And we're live. Hello, and welcome to Debut Spotlight. I'm Rachel Barenbaum, author of A Bend in the Stars and the forthcoming novel, Atomic Anna. And today, my guest is David Hoon Kim, who wrote the spectacular debut, Paris is a Party, Paris is a Ghost. I read this book actually this summer, and I have been dying to have David on my show to talk to him about language because I'm obsessed. And this book is pretty much centered on language and questions of language. I'm going to read to you a little bit from his bio so you can, listeners out there who don't know him will know a little bit about David, and then we're going to dive right in. So, David Hoon Kim is a Korean-born American educated in France who took his first creative writing workshop at the Sorbonne before attending the Iowa Writers Workshop and the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown. His fiction has appeared in The New Yorker, Brin d'Eternité, Le Sabour, and XYZ, La Revue de la Nouvelle. He writes in English and in French. And I have a horrible accent and hope I didn't slaughter that French too terribly. David,
No,
I'm thrilled to have you. Thank you so much. Can you tell
thank you so much
me?
for having me.
Thanks. Can you tell me in just a few sentences your log line? Tell me, what is Paris is a Party, Paris is a Ghost about?
Sure. It's about an ethnically Japanese Dane who is studying in Paris and who falls in love with a Japanese art student from Japan. And at one point, he kind of fantasizes about better times because actually he's at the start of the book he's going through kind of a troubled time with her and with also with finances and things like that. And so he kind of fantasizes about going down the See, he doesn't actually fantasize about going down the Champs-Élysées, but the street that is actually on the opposite side of that axe, the Avenue de la Grande Armée, and he calls that the B side of the Champs-Élysées. And um, it occurred to me that the book is actually about kind of like about the B side of things, and so the A side would actually be, for example, a story about an American student studying abroad, or it would be about an Asian American studying abroad, or just an English speaker, an English speaking student abroad. And so, and not a Japanese Dane who studying abroad. And so, I guess you could say that it's kind of like about the B side of existence, or you could even say that they're fragmentary moments told in a minor key, something like that.
I love that description. So, what really grabbed me as I started reading this book were discussions around language and identity. And when I put it down, my first thought was really that there's a sadness to this book, to Henrik, to the main character. Sort of an overtone of, I don't know if it's like a gap of loneliness, of not looking but not necessarily finding a place to fit. Did you feel that when you were writing? Did you put that in there? Sort of, how can you talk about that?
Do you mean if it reflects my own experience as?
No, I mean the book as a whole. Like sometimes you put down a book, right? And you're like, oh, well, that was a happily ever after book, right? Or,
Right.
oh, that was a thriller. Or, this really made me feel, one way or another. And when I put this book down, I don't think that this is about your own life because this is clearly fiction, right? Or I don't read fiction as about the author's life. But there was a sort of a sadness to it. It was like a gray to it, where I just kept thinking I wanted to, I don't know how to feel it. Did you feel that as you were writing it? Did you put that in there on purpose, or is that just my reading, which maybe it is?
I mean, I think, yeah, I think I did feel it. I think I definitely do feel that, I mean, I didn't just put it in there as kind of atmosphere or sort of like ornament, I guess, um, because there is something quite sad about being an outsider the way Henrik is and feeling like he doesn't really um, belong. And I guess not belonging is obviously a very universal sentiment, but at the same time, I like to think that the Henrik's own sense of alienation is somewhat unique because of his, for example, linguistic situation and the fact that um, um, he's actually doubly a minority. He's not just a minority by the color of his skin, which happens a lot, but he's also a minority combined with that by the fact of him being a Danish speaker and not really who kind of passes himself as an English speaker, for example, and um, but isn't quite that either, although he did grow up speaking English as well in Denmark. So I guess I don't know. Yeah,
Yes.
and then obviously there's Japanese background as well. So I guess there's all these layers of him that are not quite there. He's not quite this, he's not quite that. But
Yeah.
it's not caught between two worlds, he's caught between many worlds, I guess you could say.
Well said. And I think because of that, I felt this loneliness, right? This longing from him. So it sort of led me directly into my next question. So Henrik has this very complicated, or I'd say multi-layered sort of parts to him, right? So he was born in Japan, he's adopted in Denmark, he goes to school in Sweden, and then he's in France, but then he wants to translate between English and French. So he has all of these layers of language. And yet I felt like he had a hard time speaking to people sometimes, right? And he says sometimes it's because of language, sometimes it's not. But I wondered if you could talk about in literary theory, a lot of times there's this idea of the in between, the space in between languages. Do you think about that a lot? I mean, it felt like
Actually, I
Henrik
do.
did. Yeah.
Yeah, I do think about the spaces between languages, and there's actually a great quote by a French philosopher, um, Barbara Cassin, who says that you actually need to speak more than one language to know that you need to speak at least two languages to know that you're speaking one language, that it's actually a language you're speaking, that it's a linguistic system. And so I do actually think about that space a lot. Um, yeah, the space between two languages, and I guess yeah,
And what do
to
you
answer
think
that.
about? Like, are things, I think that a lot it can be lost in between two languages, and it's hard to even explain
Sure.
what it is when there aren't necessarily words in one language that there are for another. What do you think about?
Um, I think yeah, of course there are words that are harder to translate, but I think Um, I think ultimately anything is translatable. I think ultimately anything is translatable, but at the same time, nothing is really translatable. So I mean, I think I think it's trying to find um, maybe maybe it's just be going the process of translating of going between of being between those two languages or between more than two languages that's what's interesting to me. So but I, I don't find it as interesting to ask to dwell on things that to dwell on what one language lacks that the other one has. I don't know. I think it's more I guess I just when you're in one language, you're in that moment. You're not really thinking about like I guess you're not always thinking about one language in terms of its relationship to other languages. I guess that's kind of
Yeah,
how I
but
see it.
sometimes I feel like there's a space that you can't make up, right? If you even if you're in one language, if you're trying to convey an idea that exists in one that doesn't in another, this sort of bridge that you can't quite make. But it sounds like, I mean, I guess you're just a really good translator because, as you said, you can translate everything. But I felt
Well,
like
no, but
some Sorry, I felt like
no,
sometimes
go ahead.
Henrik had that where he couldn't quite bridge that meaning or that space with other people because sometimes the language, I felt like it stood in between.
Yeah, and it's obviously more interesting to have to talk about someone who is having trouble translating than someone who can do it really well, like his friend René, for example, at the translation school. He meets someone at the translation school where he studies at a later point in the book, and that's he kind of sees him as like someone who has two native languages, and so who can really like who is kind of like the ideal translator supposedly. Although I am aware that just because you have two native languages doesn't mean you can translate between one or the other.
Yeah.
Um, that said, I don't consider myself a very good translator either. So I guess um, um, because once again, like I think everything is translatable technically, but then nothing really is because, like I said, each language when you're in that language is its own system and um,
Hmm.
uh,
Yeah. Like even in the
even a book
book.
that
Yeah, I was going to say, even
Right,
in the book, you have Henrik trying to translate this short poem, right? And it
right,
goes through the crow, right? And all these different
right,
iterations of how to describe a crow, as you know, as
right, right.
opposed to the literal translation of the crow. It was just, you illustrated it so beautifully.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess yeah, and I guess in the end uh no, and in any case, to go back to what I was saying, I think it is like someone who is having trouble going between, who is having difficulty translating, who doesn't see it as something like that he can just do, that he or she can do, can just and then not really think about it, wouldn't be as interesting than I guess portraying someone like Henrik, who has all these issues, and some of them aren't even related to translation, and he just kind of, I don't know, I think he just has a lot of issues, in terms of his life, and I guess uh, it just kind of like seeps into his relationship with his languages,
Yeah,
and
yeah. I love it. So right from the beginning, I like to just, pull out little pieces that grab me right from the beginning where Henrik's standing there, and he thinks that he hears j'ai froid, I'm cold, or it could have been ta voix. And then later on we find out it's au revoir, right? And all these
right,
words sound so similar. But like you were saying, when you're struggling, I guess, to translate, to hear, to understand what's happening, even if you might know the words, sometimes you don't always know. You can twist the words to what you think you might be hearing. I don't know. That's what I thought, especially because he didn't hear au revoir. He didn't hear the goodbye, right?
but it's also kind of not clear whether is it really on him or is it on her partly too, because of her trouble um with the language, and that's
Yes.
also kind of like it's kind of a special relationship when you're with someone and you're communicating through a language that's neither that's a foreign language to both of you. So I kind of that was my attempt to explore that aspect as well. um
Yeah.
as you can see, it doesn't often have very good results. So
No, it
um
did. And I loved it. And you even said at one point, the words, even buffered by a foreign language, nearly caught in my throat. Right. When he tries
right,
to say, right, just before that, trying to say, I love you. I mean, right. It's different in different languages. I love the way you approach language and you ask these questions about language in this book. It just had me thinking for days. So I really appreciated it. And then I felt like you layered on top of that questions of appearance. And so early on in the book, for example, Henrik is a translator, and he's hired to translate for a blind man. And he doesn't realize at first that the man is blind. And he's so used to people looking at his face, right, and thinking
right,
one thing, and then being surprised to hear that actually he's Danish, but he can speak French and English, right? They're thrown by his appearance and his background, except the blind man sort of took him at face value. Um, and so could you talk a little bit, there are some other instances in the book where you also, sort of question the relation of appearance to people's assumptions and things. Is that something you could talk a little bit about, what you were thinking as you were writing?
um yeah, I think maybe thinking about it just now, I think maybe I wanted to approach it from that angle, or maybe because of my experience living in Europe, living in France specifically, in the sense that I felt much more visible as a person, as a person of color in France than I do in the US. Because although France is a multicultural country, and quite possibly the most multicultural country in Western Europe, I do feel that it's definitely not uh, the same as living in, say, Southern California, or even other urban centers in the U.S., where I, I I felt much more visible, and so I think maybe it made me think about it more than I guess I would have if I had lived in the U.S. when I was uh, I mean, if I hadn't lived in France, for example. So I think maybe that was a catalyst. It occurred to me.
Yeah.
Um,
Because then you contrast that with one of the characters. She is a model for art students. So she sits there, right, in the class. And
right,
this one guy in particular freaks her out because she feels like he sees, I don't know, like more or something that's not there. But there she is caught in the gaze, right? But she's chosen to be there. But again, you're sort of nailing someone to this appearance of, well, what do we see? And you have art students drawing, and she can't see what they see. right?
Right.
And how they're
Yeah, I
portraying
guess.
her. It was a great contrast to that.
Yeah,
So
that's a really interesting um take. I wasn't thinking about that angle at all. So thanks for pointing
it
it
was
out.
it was just there in the writing.
Right,
Well, it's because I think
right,
that there's this, the consciousness of the book is the relation of how do we, I mean, at least what I read, right, was very much of how do we relate to the world, both in terms of appearance and language, or sort of how do we mingle with people. And that you have the gaze, people looking in, and then how you project yourself through words, through language, which is how we communicate many times. And you caught that. And also you had, again, when the art students were drawing the cadaver. I don't want to give too much away, but just to say that there's this point where they were trying to flip her over, and they didn't realize she was Asian, they said, until they had flipped her over. And again, it
right.
was, it's just a human body until then. So was that another part where you were thinking about appearance, or why
Yeah,
did
I
you just,
think yeah, in that instance, I actually was definitely thinking about uh another take on how appearances can be um occulted or obscured, I guess, in this particular situation, as it was in the previous instance of with the blind physicist not being able to see him. Yeah, so I guess this was kind of like I wanted to just kind of explore another situation where ethnicity can be obscured in a way, or uh, where someone could be seen differently because uh, you can't see their ethnicity, for example, as in the terms of in terms of a cadaver lying on its stomach. So yeah,
yeah.
um,
And all the effort to turn her over was like a
right,
little,
right, yeah,
a little gruesome, and yet made a very good point. Okay, so let's move on. I want to talk about ghosts. And one of my favorite passages, and I think other people have also quoted this passage in the book. If anybody has a copy, here we are on page 147, where you've written, "There are ghosts everywhere," she finally said. "The city is filled with them. It's become a giant cemetery." When I asked her what she meant, she looked around at the nearby shelves as though we might not be the only ones in the bibliothèque. A few days earlier on the train, she had nodded silently at an empty corner of the otherwise packed car. It could have been a puddle of vomit or a dog dropping out, but Mary Vaughan had said, a ghost. After that, whenever I noticed an inexplicable gap in a crowd or a mysteriously vacant seat on a bus, her words came back to me. I just thought that was so great. This idea of, making these ghosts in Paris, but also anywhere, right? Where you have an inexplicable gap. Can you talk about that?
right. Um, sure. Yeah, I'm just always interested in absences, I guess, and what I guess manifestations of absences, which kind of sounds like a an oxymoron, but um, I think maybe the book is kind of about absences too, in general, because for example, Henrik's relationship with Fumiko, the Japanese art student, is you never really actually see them. It The book is really about the aftermath of their relationship, and so she's kind of an absent character, and I think maybe I could be wrong about this, but French literature is very interested in absences. I mean, um, or rather, the languages were interested in absences in terms of as kind of like a dramatic tool, like having a character who's not there, who's absent, and who never appears, but who is often talked about, and around which the story evolves. And so I kind of wanted to, yeah. So I guess in a way that was ghosts in Paris could be I don't know, a metaphor for absent people and just I guess things that you're haunted by, things that happened, um, or something like that.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I think it's a great metaphor. And I like that idea of thinking the cemetery, right? All these ghosts all around us. Because in a sense, they do haunt us, right? The other ideas or, people we've lost, or, even the metaphorically, like things that weigh us down, right? There could be all sorts of gaps there. And similarly, I thought that the very last word of the book, or the very last sentence of the book, similarly sort of talked about this absence, or which I felt like was a heavy absence again, where you said, let's see, where do I start here? Like typing over a word with another word, then with another again and again, until there's only an indecipherable jumble of letters, I thought to myself as I gave her a smile that reflected none of the chaos and turmoil and sorrow inside of me. I just thought that was so, right? That summed up Henrik's, right? What was inside of him, the chaos, the turmoil, right? And typing
Hmm.
over and over again. I imagine him doing it in so many different languages. Did you think about that? That sort of, can you talk about the turmoil or chaos a little bit more that was in Henrik's head in his life?
Um, sure. I mean, I guess he's just someone who's weighed down by a lot of things by that point, because by that point he's lived through the relationship with Fumiko, and he's also, I don't know, he's been living in Paris for, I don't know, I guess close at least 10 years by that point, and he's no longer, I guess, the sort of like, I mean, I don't want to, like, maybe innocent or whatever kind of student when he arrives um earlier in the book. Um, so I guess I wanted to kind of acknowledge that, just kind of like the kind of the weight that he was carrying, and the psychological weight of having, um, I don't know, having been kind of living like a ghost all these years, in a sense, because he doesn't actually, like I was saying earlier about the B side of existence, the B side of things. He's never actually in the center of anything, um, and um, yeah. So I guess
Yeah.
he's kind of, it's always kind of a struggle with that for him
Yeah.
in the book.
So I've grilled you so much on language here. Thank you for entertaining my questions, because this is really what got me. But I also wanted to ask you, this is a novel in some ways, but also, you could argue there's some short story pieces too, right? There are parts that you could take out that could stand alone. And yet they weave together beautifully. How did you think about this in terms of a novel or a short story? A
Yeah, I'm
collection.
really glad you asked me that, because yeah, it's I guess when I was writing it, to be honest, I always thought of it as a collection of linked stories, and so um, it's not. I guess it's really not up to me to say if it works as a novel or not. I have to say that um, it's more like I would say it's more like a fragmentary chronology. It's more like a fragmentary biography of someone, and so kind of these moments in his life. So so I don't know if that answers your question in terms of like,
It
if I
does.
think of it.
I mean, it says right on the cover, a novel,
Right.
right? And yet,
Right.
when I read it, I was thinking, I don't know, it sort of read to me like, I was thinking, I wonder if he wrote this as a collection of linked short stories and then
Hmm.
realized they came together, right? But then what
um
is the line between the two? Collection of short,
right,
right?
right.
Fragmentary novel versus short stories that are linked. I don't know, that's like a
Right.
bigger question for literature.
I think the problem is it could be that it's neither one nor the other. Quite, it's not quite one nor the other.
Hmm.
I have to say that it wasn't entirely my idea to call it a novel. So and but at the same time, I realize that it's somewhat problematic because it's not straightforward a collection of short stories. So um, I guess the question is, what exactly is it? But um, maybe it's also like in between things, like it's in between the way like Henrik is in between languages. Maybe it's in between these two things, the novel and the short story, which are two ends of a spectrum, maybe.
I think it
Um,
fits. I mean, it works because of that, right? You're not just telling a straight story because it's not just a straight life. So
right.
I
Yeah.
think that works. So, what was the hardest part about getting this book published?
Um, I would say that there were a lot of things, but I would say that it's just kind of the uncertainty. You would think that after you sell a book that everything is certain now. I mean, there's a degree of certainty, but I think it was always like I I was never quite sure when things were happening or when other things would happen, and so often it was like in this sort of like limbo like space, and I found that it was a bit frustrating, I have to say. But
What do you mean that you weren't sure what was happening?
well, just things that well, like during the editing process, like when certain things would like like when the editing was when the next stage of editing would happen, or when there would be things like I don't know, covered, I don't, just to say something randomly, cover design, or just kind of the jacket copy, things like that. It was never um I think I think it's a pretty typical trajectory to not really know when certain things are happening, and so it involved a lot of waiting and things like that. But once again, that it would seem that it's very typical, and um, yeah, and then obviously just kind of having to do things for the first time and make decisions. Like, for example, I never, obviously after before this book, I never worked on an audiobook. I had never worked like well, not that I read the book myself, but I mean finding a reader and then um and things like that. And I actually found that a bit frustrating because I really wanted someone who could speak French, and it was compounded by the fact that uh, it had to be someone who was Asian American. I mean, not it's not something I insisted on. It's something that had to be that way, and so I think it added a degree of difficulty to the process, and because I think there aren't a lot of Asian Americans who speak French well enough, who know French well enough to read, like to deal with all the French in the book. So, like the little words and sentences. Not that the book has that much French, relatively speak. I mean, absolutely, but yeah. So it was a bit of a tricky process, I have to say.
Yeah. And
Um,
obviously those parts were important to you. So, it was good to, that you
yes,
were on top
it
of
was.
them.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah.
great. Okay, and so my last question, because listeners always want to know, is what kind of advice do you have for new writers? And I'm just going to say, while you think about that for a minute, I'm going to add here's on the banner for people who are watching, or in case you're listening, you can find David at www.davidhoonkim.com. You can also find links to him on my websites and Mighty Blaze. So, what advice do you have for new writers?
Um, I would say that I would say that that you should that the actual writing process should be the most important thing for you, because after that it's really out of your control. So I think really you thing you have to like the most by far is writing the actual writing and revising your book before it's submitted. I think if that's not by far for you the best part of this process, I think what you expect is not likely to correspond to what happens after you submit the book. And also, I think you should like, I think reading should be at least as important to you as writing. That's just my take on it since you asked me. So yeah,
That's great. I could not agree more. I feel like people ask me, or they'll say sometimes, like, "Oh, I don't have time to read." I say, "Then how can you write if you can't read?" I don't know. That's how I
right.
feel.
Right.
That's how I learn most things, and
So I
I
agree. It's hard to find time to read. I mean, these days, especially like with the way things are. I mean, it's hard to. It takes a certain amount of concentration. Just like I mean, just like it takes concentration to write, it takes concentration to read. So yeah, it is. It's not obvious.
yeah. David Hoon Kim, thank you so much for joining me. I
Sure. Thank you
really
for.
loved chatting, and may you sell many, many books.
Thank you.